Good morning, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of the CLIC, our Center for Learning and Innovation in Knowledge, it is my pleasure to welcome everyone, all of you, colleagues, friends, to this second session of the cycle of reflection and debate on university teaching. This series aims to foster reflection on multifaceted aspects of higher education. And what I especially like about this cycle, as I understand it, is its intention to be more than just a series of talks, but an opportunity for all of us to come together as a community to share insights, to challenge our preconceptions, and to collaboratively envision the future of our profession in higher education. Today, the session is about assessment and social justice, very relevant topics, or better say, relevant responsibilities for higher education, especially for public universities committed to upholding equity and fairness in a challenging world. And we are, I believe, incredibly fortunate to have Dr. Jan McArthur as our expert speaker. Jan serves as the head of department and senior lecturer in education and social justice in the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University. She has extensive publication record, including several books and numerous journal articles that explore various dimensions of higher education, social justice, and assessment. This includes a book that has been translated into Spanish and published by Narcea in 2019 with the title of La evaluación, una cuestión de justicia social, perspectiva crítica y prácticas adecuadas. Jan is renowned for her insightful talks on assessment for social justice and her innovative approach to rethinking the notion of authentic assessment. Jan's talk today will be provocative, I think, or at least it has a provocative title. Assessment for Social Justice, it is beyond our imagination. After her talk, we will have time for discussion, hopefully with your participation. In her talk, Jan will argue that if we are serious about changing and rethinking teaching and learning, then we must be prepared to reimagine assessment. Maybe, she says, even to think the unthinkable. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jan as she comes forward to share her insights and perspectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation to come here and for the very warm welcome that I've had. I will try and speak slowly. For those of you who don't know, I'm Australian, but I live in Scotland, but I work in the northeast of England. So my accent has had all sorts of things done to it. So I'll try and speak slowly and clearly, and if I'm not, please somebody just wave your hand. So my aim today is to be provocative, but not provocative just for the sake of it. I think thinking differently is an intensely practical thing to do. And so I know there are many reasons why probably everything I suggest today can't be done. But I think the idea of these circles of reflection is to try and find the time to do that, thinking the unthinkable. The thing about assessment in higher education or anywhere is that generally people say it's too important to fiddle with. My view is the opposite. It is so important to what our students learn and to who they are when they go out into the world that we have to take it seriously and be prepared to look at it very differently. The world that our students are living in, the world that we're living in now, the world they're going on to, is one with drought, we have floods, we have bushfires. If you're like me in Australia, we can have all of those at the same time. We have war, and we have a cost of living crisis. In a moment, I'll talk about why I don't like the phrase the real world, but to the extent that we're going to talk about the real world, this is the world. This is the world that we are educating our students for. And when I came up with the idea for assessment for social justice, and it's very nice that these days it's a little more welcome, still quite unwelcome in a lot of places. But when I first came up with it, I was sort of derided, made fun of for some of the ideas. But it perhaps as people have come to see the seriousness of the world around us, the idea makes a bit more sense. But basically, the idea of assessment for social justice was to take the enormous body of tremendous scholarship on assessment for learning, which shows us that students, how we assess shapes what and how students learn, and to add that to the idea of social justice. And assessment for social justice is simply, if we're concerned about social justice, and if we know assessment shapes how and what students learn, then clearly we need to be thinking more about assessment for social justice. And this led to the book that was translated into Spanish, which was a real honour and has allowed me to meet a lot of new people. And one of the things about this idea of thinking about assessment for learning, thinking about social justice and the world we live in, is that even in an assessment context, we need to always think about the student as a whole person. And indeed, if you're interested, I have one journal article that is in Spanish, and it is about this, about the student as a whole person, and thinking about them, thinking about assessment in those terms, and not always in terms of just one discrete task. I want to say something before I keep going about the challenge of generative artificial intelligence, because everyone's talking about it, and in fact there's a lot of what we'd say in English, sort of chatter, just noise talk, without it actually being meaningful, because it's very hard to know really at this moment the full implications of generative AI for assessment. But here's my stance, for what it's worth, that how we respond to generative artificial intelligence and how we nurture holistic and authentic assessment must rest on values and principles that we should have attended to long before generative artificial intelligence. In other words, if we want to address the challenges that we now face and the opportunities about assessment, we can't just put more on top. We've got to get our house in order in terms of some of the fundamentals of assessment. And so how we make the best of generative artificial intelligence and how we protect against the dangers cannot rest on technical solutions alone. It requires human solutions, and no more so than in the field of university assessment. I don't know what the situation is here, but in the UK, there's this sort of technological arms race where people, led by companies like Turnitin, and that's never going to really help us come to terms with generative AI and our students' work and their well-being and their contribution to society. And in that initial book, I used the concept of general understandings, which is a concept from Shatsky's social practice theory. And these are about dispositions and ways of valuing a task. So when we as assessors and students, as those being assessed, come to an assessment task, what sort of dispositions and values should we have? And the 5 I talk about in the book are not an unlimited list. They're examples. So trust, which at the time, as I said, I got made fun of a fair bit about, well, how can you have trust in assessment? But if you go to conferences now when people are thinking about what do we do about generative AI, trust might be all we have left. So honesty, responsibility, forgiveness, responsiveness. I won't go into these in depth here today, but I just want to go back to this idea that the way we approach assessment should be based on thinking about values, dispositions, and then how they then form the task, rather than thinking about a task in isolation. So now the topic of today is about imagining differently, because I think that's the purpose of your reflective cycles. And I want to just pause for a moment with some lessons from critical theory. If you're familiar with my work, you know that I would use a lot of critical theory, largely first generation, Adorno and Horkheimer. I like their radical pessimism. I like their challenge, that particularly Adorno, keep us on our toes. And then also third generation, Axel Honneth, because I think his work on recognition is really helpful to understanding assessment and social justice. But if we start with my good friend Adorno, if you're familiar with his work, it's all about dialectics. It's all about hope and despair, optimism and resignation. And the reason I bring this in is that imagination and imagining differently can sound fun. And hopefully it is, but that's not all there is to it. It's also deadly serious. Imagination is not a neutral word. When we imagine, we bring values to that and make choices. Imagination cannot be used as a buzzword. I hope that translates. You know, a buzzword, a word that's just popular but maybe loses meaning. And imagination is about a deeply serious commitment to see the world differently, including in the everyday acts of what we do, such as assessment. And then secondly, from Axel Honneth, I bring an understanding of what social justice is. And Honneth says, we know what is just by that which allows the individual member of our society to realise his or her own life objectives in cooperation with others and with the greatest possible autonomy. And just there, in cooperation with others and with the greatest possible autonomy. That's the sort of dialectic, that sort of paradox that runs through critical theory and which I find so interesting. So when I talk about assessment for social justice, I'm thinking about what is just for the student, what is just for the assessor and everyone else involved in the process, and what is just for society. It has to work on those multiple levels. And those multiple levels are interdependent. So, imagining assessment differently. Let me start with 2 points. We cannot just imagine new things on top of our current practices and policies. Imagination requires some dismantling of what currently exists. And I suppose quite a bit of my talk today will be my suggestions of where in your reflective talks you might go to think about dismantling current structures. I want to just also say a point about what is academic work. Oh, my alarm's gone off. I don't know why. Excuse me. That's very rude. I'll just see if I can turn it off. I didn't even know I had an alarm on. Sorry. What is academic work? Because if we're talking about assessment or assessing academic work, and I know this seems a very basic question, but actually this is where I like to go to. I like to go to these fundamental questions. So here's just a picture of some of the things that I think represent academic work. And I'll just give you a moment to think about where my mind could be going. For me, academic work is engaging with the minds of others. If we were boil it down to one key idea, that's what it is. It is always about engaging with the minds of others. It is not about what I think about something. It's always looking into the research that's been done, the scholarship that's been done, and then bringing that and bringing our own minds and thoughts to it and our understandings and going on. From undergraduate level to PhD level, academic work is engaging with the minds of others. And unless we put that front and centre of our approaches to assessment, we will always fall short of what we could possibly achieve. So imagining. Now, again, thinking from a critical theory perspective, imagining is both thinking new and being based where we are. So a creature like this, it can't possibly exist. It's beyond our imagination, but it does. So let me start with my first point about what counts as achievement when we assess. And there we have the bumblebees. Some engineers say they shouldn't fly, but they do. It's not beyond our imagination to have bumblebees. So I'm not sure, so forgive me not understanding fully the Spanish system, but in the UK, I imagine you're familiar with learning outcomes, you use them, yep, okay. So here's a list of some fairly typically worded learning outcomes using the right sort of verbs to critically analyse research methods literature, explain the difference, successfully undertake, demonstrate critical understanding, construct a working design. These, we are told, are the foundations of good assessment. And after 20 or so years, I've come to agree they are. It's been a long route for me because the idea of predetermined learning outcomes has always worried me. But I don't think they need to be that inflexible. But the real point is, all the best practice stuff on assessment tells you that our assessment should be based on evaluating the learning outcomes. And these are how we are told to phrase our learning outcomes. There is no how much. I have not seen a learning outcome that passes the test of how a learning outcome is meant to be phrased that asks for how much. We add the how muchness on. It's not there in our learning outcomes. So think about these two of the learning outcomes I had. To construct a working design prototype of a robot, to successfully undertake an invasive biopsy procedure. That, I hope, would be the final year of medicine. If we take both of these, what does 67% look like? Where's the 67%ness there? If we had a doctor training to amputate a leg, what's 55%? When it's sort of hanging from a bit, sorry, that's a bit gruesome. I should think of a better example. But I think you know my point here. Where's the how muchness? What does the 67% look like? And our marking criteria, so we have learning outcomes and then we have marking criteria, which have gone beyond just simply a differentiation of whether the learning outcomes have been met or not, and have become completely absorbed in this how muchness. And this is where a lot of the hard grind of academic work is. And a lot of this is just history and tradition. It hasn't always been the case, and it's always important to remember that. Assessment, higher education, it has a history, and this idea of differentiating marks came at a certain point, and it didn't come out at a certain point, this would be good for learning. There are myths about that it provides incentives and feedback, but it only does if we value that number and if we have a common understanding of it. Now, anyone here who has ever taught or worked with people in North America will know that they mark very high up the percentage scale. So when I have students from North America come to my department and they get 65%, they're devastated, because 65% means something different in North America than in the north of England. So you see, it has no set meaning. And yet, we put so much of our self-worth into this, the idea of what that number is, and our students do. And I just wonder what happens to them when we do that, given I don't believe our learning outcomes make this at all necessary. And the reality is that there's pressures to replicate a competitive grading system in the spirit of norm referenced, and we shouldn't be doing norm referenced marking. We should always mark against criteria, but to enable easy and efficient differentiation of graduates, to make it easy for employers to pick who they want to employ. But that's not why I came into higher education. That's not why I set my assessment. I set my assessment to promote learning. Learning should be at the heart of it. Why do we take on systems that make no sense by our own learning outcomes, and yet research evidence has shown are a barrier to learning? They distract and they change a sense of self-worth in a way that really troubles me. And so can we imagine assessment without a grade? They do it in medicine, in Britain at least, for the very reasons I said. What's 60%, 7% of an amputation? Or at the very least, could you imagine fewer grade points? Could you make the grading really, really simple so it is really just connecting to what those learning outcomes mean? And the sense of achievement moves from that mark that says, hey, look, I'm better than everyone else, to that mark, that representation, that piece of feedback that says, you've achieved something here that is really important and can help others, and you should feel good about yourself. And you should feel really pleased that you've engaged with this piece of literature, that you've understood this poem, that you've learnt how to build a bridge. So my second point with my second animal that's surely beyond our imagination, having a duck bill and a tail and laying eggs, but it does exist, it's not beyond our imagination, is how perfect can the assessment process be? And this is clearly linked to my previous point about those grades and numbers. But how perfect can it be? Because again, one of the burdens of academic life, in my experience, and why people groan when they have a whole lot of marking, is that they're trying to get it perfect and right, and that's really hard, and it frankly wastes a lot of time. So there are, of course, certain things that we learn at university, such as the makeup of certain chemicals, certain health and safety principles. The boiling point of water is not contested knowledge. But at university, these are building blocks. Our eventual aim is to engage with complex and contested knowledge, not simple right-wrong building blocks. And scientists, don't tell me it's different for you. I've come off 8 years of a project on chemistry and chemical engineering, and I found out your world is far more complex and contested and interesting, as you sometimes try and tell those of us in the social sciences. So these are just the building blocks. This is not the focus of the sort of assessment I'm talking about, but I'm recognising these are important at early stages. This is a rubric, and don't worry, I don't expect you to see the whole thing. You use rubrics here? Yeah, so I have the fortunate position of being old enough to remember when rubrics first became a thing. And I want to be careful here that I'm using the word marking criteria and rubric to mean two different things. Now, increasingly today, they're often conflated. But if we go back 10 years or so, it was very clear the difference, that rubrics came in as a further way of interpreting the marking criteria, as a way of hopefully giving more transparency and also accountability, about being able to show a student why they got 67%. Because look, we can break it down into these bits. And if you break the task down into these little bits, it will be easier for you. So I understand the meaning, but we had our learning outcomes, which we then had to further interpret with marking criteria, which we then further interpret with rubrics. And this is what I call my monster rubric. This is written by hard-working academics trying really hard to do the right thing. It's for a final history dissertation. So we're not talking building blocks of knowledge here. And for first thing you can see, there's just a lot there. I've got to look at that page and read this dissertation on the French Revolution. And here they break it down into detail. So firstly, somebody has sat down and decided that the development of scholarly conversation should weigh 8% of the total mark, while the critical thinking content discourse should be 9%. How long did they take to work that out? And on what criteria? And where can I see those criteria if this is all about greater transparency? So that's the first problem. The second problem is, let's say, compare critical thinking content discourse and critical thinking integration of ideas. I don't know the difference. I've marked for years and years and years. You know, I can see the words there, but I can't get it out of my mind that I'm reading this final piece of work on the French Revolution. And like, what could be more exciting? There's gunpowder and explosions and guillotines and big dresses and sex and intrigue. All of this is happening in the French Revolution. And I've got to look at this piece of paper and work out content critical, what's it, from critical thinking, integration of ideas. Where's the joy? Where's the joy in engaging with that student's work if we break it down into these tiny little bits because we think that that can make it look that we've perfected the assessment process? And for our students also, well, we do have the building blocks of knowledge, so they do need to learn the palette of colours that they might paint a beautiful painting with. At the end of the day, that painting has to be understood in the whole. What does it do to just break it into one little bit? It makes sense by the contrasts and the changes and what repeats and what doesn't, and the colours together and the sky and the foreground. Students engaging with complex forms of knowledge should not be made afraid of seeing the whole. And yes, we sometimes do parts along the way, but this atomistic idea of assessment through then marking criteria, then very precise rubrics, in the name of being able to say to a student, there is a mark and that's perfect, you can't disagree with it. It's just, I don't see what we gain, I just see what we lose. Students should be aiming in whatever discipline for that disciplinary equivalent of that beautiful painting. And can we imagine the forms of engagement with knowledge where we accept that it is rarely perfect, simple, or uncontested? Surely we say we want our students to be critical thinkers. Then let's help them be critical thinkers by understanding that knowledge is not perfect, it's not simple, and it's not uncontested. And we just go through life dealing with that. That's what engaging with the minds of others means. So now to the avocet. Now, a computer might tell you that bird's not real because the beak's the wrong way, it's turning up. Beaks don't do that, they go straight or they go down. But not with an avocet. Avocets show us that we can imagine otherwise. And here I want to talk about technology. We should not imagine that technology, that doesn't read right, sorry, to absolve us of responsibility to teach the academic craft and to assess it in honest, authentic and genuine ways. This is my next point, and it's not anti-technology, but it is about academics claiming back their role as the people who teach the academic craft, which is engagement with knowledge. And here I'm particularly going to talk about Turnitin. You use Turnitin here? Yeah, okay. It's good. Then you might not like what I have to say, but I'm going to say it. So, how do we assess? We make judgments, our judgments when we assess, and we cannot and should not skip this responsibility. Academic work is always about engagement with the minds of others. So what happens if we make students fearful or tentative about engaging with the minds of others? So I'm going to pause here for a minute for this book that I came upon by accident. Do you know the word Luddite? So the Luddites were the people in early industrial England in a certain area who smashed up the machines. And so there's an expression in English, if you're anti-technology, you're called a Luddite, you know. So it's meant as an insult. But when I read the introduction to this book, the editor explains that Luddites weren't anti-machines. They were against two things that the machine stood for. The first is the working conditions. And I really think the working conditions of assessment for most academics are terrible. And secondly, they were against the product, that they believed the product did not do as much, did not achieve the product that they could produce by other means. So when I come to my good friend Turnitin, I'm not a Luddite in the sense of I'm anti-technology. I'm head of a department that teaches nearly all online. We have a leading centre in technology enhanced learning. But I'm against two things. One, against the working conditions of assessment. Assessment for social justice means more social justice for you, not just for students and society. It means making life better. But secondly, I'm against the product. Because this idea of this originality score, and I know some people use it in a formative, constructive way, but essentially, for a poor undergraduate coming in, it makes them feel that the higher their originality score, the worse their assessment. And in my country, some universities have something like an arbitrary 25% point where it automatically triggers something to go to the first stage of a plagiarism case. That is a case for cheating. This scares students. Students have been, there's strong evidence that they'll take out a couple of references or change something about to get their score below 20 to please turn it in. They're trying to please turn it in. They've lost the joy that actually engaging with the minds of others, which could give you a huge Turnitin originality score, beautifully, perfectly referenced, engaging with the minds of others is good. And I really worry about how we've got to this point. And again, I want to say to people, there's history here. This is not inevitable. I remember a time when we didn't do this, and that's not a golden age thing. That's just saying we can imagine ourselves out of this. It is not inevitable. And in my view, the conflation of poor referencing skills and plagiarism being the intention, the deliberate intention to deceive, has been disastrous for academic integrity, academic writing, and authentic assessment. All Turnitin can do is highlight where somebody has used text from somewhere else. You then have to interpret whether they've used it well, whether they've cited it ethically, all sorts of things. And yet it's led to this, at least in my country, this plagiarism-led pedagogy. And in the first week of university, if you look at, sorry, just for a moment, if you look at these things, these are sort of fairly typical, like a generic set of things that we might say to a student, this is what we're looking for in our assessment. But why is there just one of them that we demonise? We have these plagiarism talks in the first week of university in the UK. Whatever you do, don't be caught. We don't do it about critical analysis. Now, whatever you do, make sure there's critical analysis or you'll be caught, you'll be put to a committee and you'll be labelled a cheat because there's no critical analysis. It doesn't make sense, does it? So why do we take these poor young people and put this pressure on them? And why not do we just reinforce the joy of engaging with the minds of others and doing it in an ethical and responsible way? So can we imagine taking back control of our assessment processes and demolishing the structures that make students fearful to engage with the minds of others? Can we imagine that? And my next point, what is authentic assessment? So I wrote an article about this recently, and it was a critique of the authentic assessment in a lot of countries now has become a buzzword. Everyone's talking about authentic assessment. People think authentic assessment is going to help us out of generative AI. It's going to solve everything. But I'm worried about the way in which people use this term, and this is what my article is about. So first of all, people talk about real-world tasks. And very quickly, the real world is conflated with the world of work. If you read an article on authentic assessment, it'll start off talking about, the real world and the world out there. Paragraph 3, it'll be about the world of work. And the problem is that this makes this real world external to our students. Our students know the real world. They're the generation that's gone through COVID and all of that this cost of living crisis. They're probably fearful of the war that's going on. In the UK, in terms of the desperateness of the post-Brexit situation, it's just grim and unforgiving, the world. Let's not tell them that they're not in a real world that's out there. and they're just here. I don't know what this space is if it's not the real world. And the real world is something they cannot change. They're just meant to accept. You're meant to prepare for the real world. And very quickly that becomes what employers want, and very quickly that becomes assessment for a compliant workforce. If you think back to those images of drought and flood and poverty, a compliant workforce isn't where the solutions lie. So in my work on authentic assessment, I've argued that there is one approach which is as things are. So we accept the real world as it is, we accept that concept, we accept the world of work as it is, we seek to sustain, albeit, try and improve because we're good people, the current organisation of society. And my alternative would be, imagining differently, to move from thinking about the real world, the world of work, to focus on society. To move from the task performance to why we value the task. There are a lot of tasks being done in the so-called real world that we shouldn't value and which are harmful to our society and our planet. And we need to move from the status quo that this concept of real world of work brings to one of transforming society. And so that first point, from the real world of work to society, we move from compliant workers and a monetised sense of self-worth, from the externalised real world, a rarefied world we cannot change, to one where we re-embrace society and we make this explicit. And in a study I wrote with some colleagues about an engineering piece of assessment that was done in South Africa, it was during water poverty, and this was an assignment to think about ways to relieve water poverty. So it was deeply important. And of course, water poverty in South Africa is closely related to racial justice and so forth. But what we found is that the students did the task, but there was no time or space or opportunity for them really to think about it as a socially situated thing of importance. They just did that assignment and rushed on to the next. So it looks like an authentic assignment, but in terms of the impact on the students, it wasn't. We need to transcend associations of authentic assessment just with vocational. So for example, Gothic literature, which is a specialism amongst colleagues at my university, Gothic literature is all about social marginalisation and exclusion. We need specialists in that, in the world we have, because we live in a world where social exclusion and marginalisation is rife. From task performance to why we value the task. So it's the reason for the task should shape how we do it, such as responding to climate emergency. You could ask an engineer to design a factory that reduces the owner's costs of pollution. That's easy to do because by certain ways, the costs of the horrible stuff being emitted can go over into what, state-funded anti-pollution things. It's different to design a factory that reduces pollution as such. And that's why we need to value the task. And we also need to see the value in smaller things. A student perhaps working on a filter that can be used again for perhaps a factory. They need to think about that child with asthma who lives down the road and to see how their work is valuable, because it then helps them feel valuable as members of society. And they also need to think about that child on the other side of the world who they'll never meet, but who will also benefit from the work they do. It's not just technical, this sort of work. It's deeply important to our social well-being. And we need to move from the status quo to one thinking of transforming society. Richter, who writes on critical theory, talks about palonomy, the standing inside and outside at the same time. And so in my view, authentic assessment or authenticity is not to join the world that exists, but to contribute to the world that could be. So can we imagine authentic assessment that is genuinely connected to the world in which we live? What would that look like? And finally, imagine if assessment was joyful. As I said, Most people I know groan when they have a big pile of essays. They don't look at it and think, here, look at all of this, what students have achieved. I can't wait to read it. Because they know they'll be there till 3 a.m. and working all weekend and that. But imagine if assessment was joyful. And joy, let's go back to the Luddites and about the conditions of work. Practical things to help towards joy. Program level design. A lot of us repeat the same assessments. A lot of us feel the whole burden of a student being able to do this or this or this. I don't know how it is here, but in the UK, 25 years ago, it was program level. Now, 25 years later, everyone's saying, what if we did program level? But it really does help that talking with colleagues so that assessment is genuinely a journey for the student and we have that genuine formative assessment for learning can only happen if we talk to each other and don't live in our own individual modules. Assessment methods that are genuinely suited to the knowledge task being evaluated. Really think about what you're trying to do and does that assessment task work? Very rarely will a traditional exam be your answer. Build into curriculum design the time and space to enjoy engaging with the minds of others. So those South African engineering students, they would have been so up to really thinking through the bigger dimensions, both local and broader, of addressing water poverty. But they existed in an engineering curriculum that is so jam-packed and so about going from one thing to the other that there was no time. And I would argue we have to rethink what are the valuable things. I know our curriculums are busy, but just like, you know, if you edit a journal, there's never a journal article you find that couldn't be benefit from being edited down a bit. The same with most curriculums. Most really could bear with a little bit coming out and a little bit more time and space. And we need safety instead of fear. So we don't want the fear of plagiarism led. We also need safety and forgiveness in terms of, can a student do a task, mess it up, and be allowed to redo it in a safe way? Because we know that learning is by doing. There's not a single bit of credible, research on how learning occurs that doesn't say we learn, we do, we mess up, we make mistakes, we learn. Are we building that into our assessment systems? Because that would bring back the joy if we weren't so fearful of failing. And we need better working conditions. Happy staff make happy students. So when we think about joy, learning and achievement, why are we really assessing our students' work? That's the first question when you start to imagine differently. Really, what is the purpose? Go right back down, deep down to what that is. Why are we really using the grading systems that we use? And I know a lot of these things are mandated by the institution, but where are the little bits, where are the little fissures, where are the little cracks where you can do something different? Whose interests are we really assessing for? You know, if we don't feel joy, it's often because we know we're just working the system and we've forgotten what we really care about. And do we understand the place of assessment in our broader professional and civic responsibilities? So can we imagine assessment of our students' work being a joyful experience? And to finish, okay, I hear this all the time. People will object, employers won't like it, we cannot change the regulations, that's not how we do assessment here, it's naive, I've been called that a lot, it will never work. Fair enough. Here's my reply. If we're going to be criticised, at least let's be criticised for something that we believe in. Something based in years of credible educational research, something joyous and hopeful, and something that might just make the world a bit better in these troubling times. Thank you. Do you want me back there? Yes? Okay, I'll just put my one.
Thank you very much for this indeed insightful, and I think has been indeed provocative, has made our imagination actually be active. And let's now start with the discussion with all of you. For me, your last message is about being trying to foster supportive environments and not environments that are oriented towards punishment is one of the key messages among all the very important messages that you have been spreading across the speech. But now let's see the questions that you have, the audience have. Questions, comments? As for the moment, yeah, we have a question there.
Thank you so much. I don't know if I had a question. I have I have enjoyed so much your inspiring talk, so thank you very much. And perhaps it's not a question, perhaps it's the necessity to share with you and with my colleagues that this speech is so difficult to introduce in some so large neoliberal academia. In my case, for example, I try to structure my subjects, gender and media and consumer psychosociology, from a ecofeminism point of view. And I really, for me, it's enjoyable, but I see the difficulties for students to assume that, for example, we develop a project outside from development, las ODS, outside from that.
Sustainable development
Sustainable,
goals.
yes, outside from that. And we developed some kind of projects with non-grade, because I suggest I want you to do the best of you. Which is the grade, the final grade of each exercise? There is no grade. I want just to hear to you, and I assume you will do the best. And it's very difficult. Finally, they accept these conditions because I am the teacher. But at the end, I have to realize that when they evaluate, because they evaluate us, a part of the students, she demands tasks, but she didn't evaluate, she didn't offer a quantitative mark of each exercise. And sometimes it's sad to read year by year this. So I really, I feel that your talk has been so inspiring, because it's recovered the hope to maintain this kind of how we assume the learning in high institutions. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you for, sorry, there you go. Thank you for those comments. You made me think that someday, when I'm brave enough, I should rewrite this talk for students, because part of the answer is that, as I said, I mean, if we're thinking about a typical, undergraduate, maybe 18 to 21, I can't imagine what it's like to be that at this age. Well, actually, I have two sons, 21 and 20. One of them said to me, "Mum, is the world always this point, hopeless?" So I think it's really important that when I say all of these things, I also counter it by saying, this is stuff that would be frightening to students if it was just presented to them as I present it to you. But I do think one practical thing we can do, even if however constrained we are, is to talk with our students more about assessment, to do it early and to talk about it, to talk about the systems we have and maybe how they might not be the best system, but that's the system we've got. How are we going to make the best of that? You want to do well? Of course you want to do well. But can we think about what doing well means? You know, in 10 years' time, what is it you want to have got out of this experience? And most students aren't cynical if they're given that little bit of safe space to bring that out. I strongly believe that even in this neoliberal world and all the horrible pressures, I strongly believe that deep down a lot of students do still want to learn. And a lot of evidence shows that they do still come to university, they choose a love of subject. So, you know, there's good stuff to build on. The problem is that we're constrained by practices that just don't give us enough time, don't make it normal to do this. And there is a risk, and I know when you're talking about them evaluating you, in the UK they have something called the National Student Survey, and in any meeting you have with staff about let's design a new course, it doesn't start with what's the knowledge, what's the wonderful things we want to achieve, it's what will happen to our NSS scores. And it's very hard. I suppose one of the things would be to say, if you're a more senior academic, maybe you can take these chances that more junior academics can't. You can take a chance. You'll survive a year of a bad evaluation. It'll hurt, but you'll survive it. So we can think of these strategies, and it's all about, for me, it's about finding the little opportunities where we can make it work. But I do think that we do not talk with our students enough about assessment. And if we did, it would help them, you know, all the talk about assessment for learning, that only makes sense if students understand that and are talked about it. And probably they've come from school, which if it's, you know, anything like the UK, where it's just all been about getting the mark to get into university, you know, that's just like their focus. So the poor things. So I think we see them as our partners, not necessarily partners in designing and the way that term is used now, but as our partners in a really difficult situation. And we talk to them about, what do you want out of it? How can I help you? With perhaps you have these ideas at the back of your mind. How could I help you? But I think now one day I'm going to try the challenge of turning this around and seeing how it looks from a student perspective. That would be quite interesting.
I will do.
Sorry?
I will do next.
Okay.
Yeah, this is very nice discussion because it connects with what are the practices that we can employ to be able to assess thinking from this perspective, no? And probably the practices have to do, many times with engaging students, no, involving students in the strategies we propose then. So I don't know if you can tell us more about the strategies, practical strategies that you know, for example, the use of learning agreements or assessment agreements, or so how to articulate that discussions or other techniques, other approaches that enable us to approach the assessment in a different way.
Okay, well, the first one is to simply have space for those conversations. So even if people often say, oh yes, but what about large classes? In large classes can be a really interesting way, a large lecture of using something to talk to students about doing things differently. I think that there is someone in the United States called Asao Inu who has done a lot on what he calls contract grading, which you have to be careful because in the UK contract cheating is when you buy an essay. So, but contract grading is where you have this sort of learning agreement, and actually you agree beforehand what mark the student will get. Effectively, the student is writing their own marking criteria. It's not differentiated, it's largely pass-fail in this case. But all of these things are a variation on the same thing, of students actually demystifying the marking process. So we know that when students engage with the marking process, such as in peer assessment or self-assessment, that they learn better. So any of these mechanisms are learning. The main thing, though, is not to turn it into another instrumental or technical exercise where it becomes about the contract and not about what the student learns by the co-creation or the creation of that contract. Because if you think about it, for a student to actually be able to say, well, I think to get a distinction, I need to be able, my goal is to better understand this, my goal is to be able to apply it to such and such. That's an incredibly wonderfully engaged form of learning. So I think these sorts of things are really important, but it's the process. So there are many different vehicles, many different things you could call it, and you could do it in different sorts of ways. And again, however constrained you are by your marking system, by your process, by your colleagues who you might be a bit worried about, they'll think you're strange, or about your students, just look for what you could do. How far could you take this? And that's a good starting point, because the one thing is academics are never as constrained as we sometimes like to think we are. And I don't know whether that happens for those of you here who work as teaching and learning people, but I sometimes go into a room of academics and I say, you could do this. And someone says, no, I can't. The regulations say I can't. And I say, well, look, I've got the regulations here. You can do it. And they'll say, no, I can't. My head of department says I can't do it. Here's your head of department. She says you can do it. Oh, no, but the dean will say I can't do it. Well, here's the dean. He's saying you can. And so we go. And they sit there, nope, can't do it, can't do it. Because they're frightened and they're under pressure too. Because that's what assessment has done to us all. It's made us anxious. So when we see people like that, it's just about trying to find those little ways and beginning there. I think I was asked to imagine, or I made up the idea that my response to your reflective cycle was to imagine. So I've done the big imagination bit, and I'm fully aware that what's going to happen in your practice is not going to be quite like that. But at least it's a way of starting to think differently. And you can always find these little ways. And working with students at the moment far too often do assessment as an act of obedience. And that is no way to learn. And that is no way to produce the graduates that we want. So we have to talk with them. So it's not about them pleasing us, being obedient, certainly not about them being obedient to the demands of Turnitin. And, people don't like me criticising Turnitin. Some people do, some people don't. It will divide the room, I imagine. But this concept of obedience is what we have to get rid of, because it's a barrier to learning. There's a lot of evidence to that. And I have a friend who's a learning specialist who has this wonderful saying. She says, most of the time, when students don't understand things or get it wrong, they have diligently and conscientiously done what they think the teacher asked. The misunderstandings because of power relationships, because of stress, pressure, whatever, between what we're looking for and what students think we're looking for are immense. So we actually do need conversations to sort that, and changes in the safety of learning. The anxiety levels of all of us in higher education, they're not good. They're not good for our health and our well-being, and they don't promote better learning. And that, at the bottom thing, is what we're here for.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your answers and examples. More questions or comments from the audience? We have more there.
Thank you very much for your talk and your work. It's really interesting. I was wondering, with the relation of your proposal to the tendency to ask professors for gamification. So gamification has been one of the mainstream proposals for for improving students' motivation. And it seems to me that your proposal is rather at the opposite side, to more responsibility, more engagement. And I would like to know your opinion about what is the relation of your proposal to the gamification proposal in...
Gamification?
Gamification. Do you know this? Adding game mechanics into the teaching and learning strategies. So using badges, scores, faces
I
you know,
thought it was a
little
term.
playful. Yeah,
I thought it was
game-based
an English
learning.
term, sorry.
Game,
Game-based learning.
Okay.
So the proposal is to make any learning as a game and to
Okay.
assess the learnings as if it was a game. Then obviously punctuation is one of the main the main exercises. So, and we have been really I think we have been pressured to make this gamification because of motivation of the students, which is one of the big problems we have. They are not motivated to learn. They are motivated to get the title or the...
Yeah. So in the UK, gamification is used to mean students playing the game, students just doing whatever they have to do to get that top result. That's not what you mean. You mean like game-based learning to make learning fun and engaging. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I don't, if I've understood it correctly, and I may not have, I don't think that's inconsistent with what I'm saying. Although I would say that one of the problems we have is that some of the things that students have to learn aren't fun. I mean, some of the things are awful, and there's a whole body of pedagogy at the moment, and I'm trying to write an article with a friend at the moment about, he's a climate scientist, and so he tells me regularly, he said, the world is so doomed that we dare not tell people, Jan, because nobody could live if they knew how bad things were. Sorry, I shouldn't have come here to tell you that. Then we think, how do you teach an 18-year-old that? How do you teach them about, the fact that we are existing in, we're going through a climate emergency? And so part of me thinks that there has to be joy. Part of me thinks we shouldn't shirk from the fact that sometimes we're going to touch on things that are deeply difficult and unpleasant. And also, there's also sometimes students will be uncomfortable. And we all know, this isn't just saying it for the sake of it, but sometimes you go through an uncomfortable experience and you haven't liked it, and you come out the other side and think, gosh, I learned a lot from that. So I don't think gamification in the sense of just making it what everyone wants and making it fun so everyone's happy. But I do think the idea of engaging students, having them actively doing things, looking for the joy, looking for the fact that even in desperate times, all we have left is to find joy in engaging with knowledge and searching for those things that can make things better. So I suppose I would see it with yes, but with some qualifications, if I've understood it correctly.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We have one question over there.
Okay, nice.
And then another one here.
Hi, thanks very much for the inspiring talk. I teach on the Open University in Universitat Oberta de Catalunya, which is fully online. And my experience, I've been trying a lot self-assessment, and I wanted to ask a little bit about what's your take on self-assessment. But what happens in our culture, I would say, is that when we tell to the students that it's going to be a self-assessed work, the first thing that comes in mind, it's like, I can grade myself? Okay. And then it's like, no, you're going to be explaining why you grade yourself. You're going to be understanding the process. You're going to be analyzing what you've learned. And they go like, oh, that's boring, which is okay. But finally, most of them are sure that if they do something that is not appropriate, or they overgrade themselves, or I'm going to be intervening, like acting to adjust. And for me, it's been very important to explain that that's not going to happen. Like, it's your full responsibility. Because if we as teachers don't accept the big challenge to truly give to the students real responsibility in a safe framework, in a specific period of time, they always feel like, oh, this is a self-assessment, but at the end, if I do something crazy, someone is going to adjust it. So I can try to make, I don't know if you get a little bit what is my approach here, but I have a sensation that in Spain in general, whenever we talk about self-assessment, there is this like kind of it's a joke, it's not serious, you can try to, and my experience has been that when it truly becomes genuine and they really feel it's completely true that they can, when we truly give the responsibility to the student, I think we are changing the paradigm and they understand it's about them, it's about their process, and I really believe it works a lot. But I wanted to know a little bit of any experiences that you have with self-assessment or how you, how do you see that?
I think it's great what you're doing. Obviously, there's probably some disciplinary differences here, and also, there's issues of where you do this and when you do it. As you know, your students are coming in and suddenly you're presenting them with something very strange. And so that does take a bit of getting used to, doesn't it? And so I think it's something that would ideally be built beyond one course or module and into something so that they can develop. But you're right, until they actually have to work with those criteria themselves of what counts as, appropriate engagement with whatever the knowledge is, till they have to do it themselves, they'll never really understand assessment, and it really helps them understand what's important in the task that you've set them. I mean, of course, if you've got really well, you have to have everything set up well, in terms of how you explain the marking criteria. And the reason I think it's so important is because in in everything we're doing, we're preparing graduates to go out into the world to be trustworthy. So, if you think about a lawyer sits in an office, there's no Turnitin in the corner, there's no invigilator to make sure that they're giving honest and ethical advice to their client. The same with doctors, there's no one there in the GP room. There might be a system for picking up mistakes later, but that can be far too late and far too tragic. We have to produce people who can evaluate their own learning and their own performance in certain tasks. So that evaluative judgment is at the heart of good learning, and also being, if we think about assessment as certification for practice, that thing that says, yes, this person's a doctor, yes, this person's a teacher, unless they have had opportunities for self-evaluation before they leave the university, when does that idea happen? And I've said this to a group of lawyers, and lawyers often will say to me, Jan, we have to have exams because law is so important that you can't have people cheat. And then there's a whole question over here that exams don't stop cheating, but even if we don't go to that question, I say, but show me your curriculum over 4 years. Where's the point that these people become trustworthy? Because you're saying you need exams because you have to be able to trust them, but you're not trusting them. So where do they learn to become trustworthy? And show me on the curriculum, where does this happen by magic? And of course they can't. But what you're doing is doing exactly that. At this place in the curriculum, students have to take responsibility. They have to understand the assessment processes and criteria, and therefore they become trustworthy. And when you say to the students, I'm not going to override your mark, when you give them that responsibility, you're giving them that responsibility of trust. And that is so important, even if we forget about the big global world problems, just for everyday functioning of society. For all people are cynical, most of it works on a basis of trust. Trust people will drive on the right side of the road, trust that they'll turn when they put their indicator on, trust that they'll, not steal from the supermarket. It's how we work. And yet when we assess our students at university, we often put them through 3 or 4 years of saying, in a big sign, we do not trust you. We can't trust you. Assessment's too important. It's the absolute opposite. So I really support what you're doing. I think, there's all sorts of issues about how you structure it in terms of a whole program, and I hope, ideally, you would have your colleagues working in complementary ways. But we have to do it because just, like I said to the lawyers, show me where They suddenly become people you can trust. And I'll give you an example. A few years ago, there was a case in fifth year medicine. In fifth year medicine, they found half the students had cheated on an exam. And it's easy to cheat on an exam, low tech, high tech. Half the students. And there was this big furor about this and how can we stop them cheating? And I thought to myself, they're fifth year medical students. After 5 years of education, it's not ingrained in them that they should be trustworthy. Like, what have we been doing for those 5 years? If after 5 years of medical training, half the people who are about to go out and look after the ill, the vulnerable, and the rest of it can't be trusted, it's not, the problem isn't the exam, the problem is the 5 years of education before that. I think there was a question here.
We have another question here. Yeah.
Thanks for the insightful thoughts. So I agree with, I would say, most, if not everything you have said. But let me try to be a little bit challenging, because in the classroom, usually we have a combination of vocational and non-vocational students. And non-vocational doesn't mean that they don't want to learn, but maybe they want to learn other subject, or they want to spend this time on a different course. So let's try to think, so what about if we had a class where 100% of the students were non-vocational, right? So how can we apply this type of, or what could you do in this type of classroom? That it's the worst case scenario, right? Because if we think about the worst case scenario, maybe we can think about, things are going to be easier than in this case.
So it's 100% non-vocational?
Non-vocational, people who, they just want this grade because they want to spend the time, say, learning course B, so they are a different subject. So can we, so we have the challenge to engage them, we have the challenge, so how can we grade them in this case?
That's really interesting. I've never been asked the question that way round. So I'll start where I'm familiar and work to the unfamiliar. So the first thing I want to say is that when I criticised, traditional ideas of authentic assessment with the real world of work, that it's really important to recognise that work is very important to well-being and social justice. We spend our working life, how we spend our working lives will impact on how happy we are as people and our well-being, and also what we do to others. So my point was that work isn't everything, though. And it really worries me that we position work as all there is to get matter about, just getting a job. But you're talking about the opposite. You're talking about a class of people. They're not necessarily there for a love of learning. They're there to get a degree, and they really don't care what happens afterwards. Is that the scenario?
Yeah, usually what we have in the classroom is some people are like that.
Yeah.
Other people are not like that. Or I want to think most people are not like that. But
yeah.
But usually this is a small group who are like non-vocational in that sense.
Oh.
They are the ones that are really the challenge to apply many of these proposals you are making.
So the problem isn't that they're just there because they want to get a job. The problem's the opposite. They just are there. Okay, gosh. You don't have £9,000 fees, do you? No. I'm thinking, I live, as I said, I live in Scotland, so in Scotland university tuition is free, but in England it's £9,000 a year. Can you believe that? It's just bonkers money. So, I'm not sure that scenario happens there. Okay, that's really good. I suppose it is still that challenging them to think about their own well-being. Because So from the position I'm coming from, which you may or may not agree with, we can't we can't be happy in ourselves unless we also see what we do that contributes to others. There's an interdependence. There's never just the isolated individual of perhaps classic liberalism. For me, it's always about an interconnected world. So I suppose it was just really challenging these students to see that unless they can see some usefulness, and I don't mean usefulness in an instrumental, purely economic way, although, you know, the economic world does matter. Unless they can see some usefulness, they'll never really fulfill themselves, you know. It is a wasted opportunity. Gosh. I'm so glad you've asked this question, because you're right. You push it to the extreme and see how it works there, and then come back. And I'm going to need to think about this, because I can come up with the sort of words about what you might say and what you could think, but, you know, if they say, yeah, whatever, it's the demonstration of it, isn't it, somehow? Maybe it's the demonstration of what some students... I think we would need to find a way to demonstrate to them why they might be happier or feel they're achieving more by thinking otherwise. You want to come back, please?
Yeah. So the other way to think about it is let's think about exactly the opposite case. So we have a class with 100 people, 100% of students who are vocational, right? They are there just to learn. So in that case, it seems that the solution could be, well, let's agree we all get the highest mark, and then let's start learning. But for some, in a sense, I have the feeling that could not work, right? So what is not working in that case?
Well, students have been so socialised into thinking that it's about getting the highest mark that it's very hard for them to disassociate the learning process. So it is something that takes time and takes a lot of conversations. And none of this would be, nothing I'm talking about on its own could be achieved in one place at one time. It's about broader changes. But I do think that we can do things with students about asking them to imagine 5 years. You know, what is it they want in 5 years? And they might say, well, you know, I want to be in this sort of a job. And explaining to them, when we have a responsibility, it isn't just about getting that mark. Because it's not about just getting a job, is it? It's about keeping that job, staying in that job. And we have this dilemma, as I see it, that schools prepare students for university, then university says, that's not what we want. We don't want people just prepared to pass an exam. We want critical thinkers. Then we prepare students for employment, and then the employers, at least in Britain, say, well, you universities aren't doing what we want. They're not the graduates we want. We're all caught in this silly cycle. So I think we need to talk to students about thinking through further what their aspirations are and helping them imagine that thing. You know, we talk about employability skills in the UK, which is awful. We should talk about what it's like to be in employment. What's it like to work 5 years in a job that you don't like? You know, it's not just about getting a job in a certain field. It's about something more and helping students and giving them the space to find that something more. But you're right. I couldn't go into a class tomorrow and give this flowery talk and suddenly it would transform all students. It is about a lot of different forms of hard work with different students. But I think the reminder that there might be core principles that we value and the sense that we have a right to say that the higher education system has drifted away from us always having those at the centre of what we're doing. And it's just bringing them back and looking for those little opportunities. And I think it's ensuring practical things like really good feedback to students that shows a sense of achievement that isn't contained in a grade. Things like that, and finding a way where they actually have to read that feedback. Maybe even having class time where they read what you've said about their work And then they maybe give a small response to it so that they've really engaged in the sense of the description about their achievement of the task. All that stuff which we pretend a grade or a mark encapsulates, but we know it actually doesn't. And I think making the time for that and the time for the student to come back, you know, like a radical version of self-assessment would be students challenging the mark we give them. But, you know, after a while, if they were doing what you're doing with your students and really engaging with the marking criteria, they'll start to challenge marks down. They'll start to challenge, there's all sorts of stuff that could happen that could be quite interesting, maybe just to try out sometime. But I do think that a practical thing is an emphasis on feedback and engagement with feedback, and even a response to the feedback would be that moment where we really see a sense of, where we get our sense of achievement. What have I done these last few months teaching this course where I'm tired and exhausted? And because we know that the course evaluations from students, it's lovely when they tell us we're great, but they don't always get really to the heart of our sense of what is it we've achieved here. But I think if we gave another forum for students, that would be quite lovely. Or not. We have to deal with that.
I think this discussion connects with what you wrote in your book, the one that has been translated into Spanish. You say, reimagining assessment offers enormous opportunities to explore richer forms of engagement with knowledge and more satisfying student-teacher relationships, no? Yes. So through these more satisfying teacher-student relationships, we can achieve higher levels of motivation that are more intrinsic, no? To what the students will know.
And there's many ways of disrupting a student's assumptions about their relationship with us. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the example up here is a great one. Suddenly their assumption that you're going to come in and say, no, you've marked wrongly, I'm going to fix this. That's an incredibly exciting thing to do. But it's funny you sitting up there. I hope you don't mind me using you as an example. There's a fabulous book, I don't know if it's in Spanish, by an American author called Ira Shaw, called When Students Have Power. And it's a really good exploration of sharing power with students because it shows that it's not about just doing what they want. So, for example, there was in this, he set a reading and the students hated it. So we don't want to read that. We want something else. Give us something else. You've told us we can challenge you. You've told us we can protest. You've told us we can have power. So our power is just give us something else to read. And of course he didn't, that's not what he did. That's not what sharing power meant. Sharing power is also sharing responsibility. What he realised though, he went back and looked at the text he'd said, and he thought, no, I really believe in this. I really believe this will help them. But clearly I've not explained its purpose well enough. So he took the student feedback, the power that their use of the power to challenge him. He didn't then just use it to say, well, I'll do whatever they want. He used it to challenge himself and go back and say to them, look, I haven't explained this well. Here's why I really want you to read this text. I really think you could get something out of it. And then he changed the nature of the task. And they engaged well, and it was really positive. And the other thing that always sticks in mind, he had this in a lecture theatre where he talked about the students in Siberia. So please excuse me using you as an example. But you know the students who always sit as far away from the lecturer as they can. And what he would do is he would get up and he would walk up and he would sit with them to obviously starts to disrupt things because the students have to engage with him differently. So just your little things about, I mean, that's sort of like a display of what you could do. But I think the thing is we have to remember that when students come in, the relationship they have with us in their mind is not necessarily the relationship we want them to have and the relationship we hope to nurture and the one that would be best for their learning. And we have to find small ways, or sometimes big ways, of disrupting that without frightening them. It's a sort of balance, isn't it? Because I think to learn, you do have to be moved to an uncomfortable place. You know, if you just stay like those students wanted to with Irish Hall, just reading the things they wanted to read, that's not what higher education's about. But the challenge can't be so much that it makes students feel alienated, isolated, frightened, stressed, and you know, I'm sure you, like us, have a problem with students' stress and anxiety and well-being. So it's, you know, it's a careful balancing act, and you can only get it right by building the right relationship with students and having those open modes of communication.
Thank you. We have a question.
Hello, and thank you for this inspiring presentation and debates. I have two questions for you. The first one would be, how do you address the challenge of diversity of educators? To give you an example, in my case, for example, I come from nursing degree, and in our case, a third part of the degree is on their clinical placements. So that means that a usual student will have about during the placement, the clinical placement, each student will have a different nurse that will do the evaluation. So I was listening to you when you were speaking about value-based learning, and that means that we need to align all educators. And I was trying to find myself trying to align all these amount of people, and I think that's a huge challenge. So I don't know how do you do it in your university to address this challenge when you have a huge diversity of teachers, educators, or whoever. That would be the first question. And the second one is about how we as academic can we collaborate with this real world, let's say, because in our case, as I said, our students spend a third part of their degree in the clinical placement. That means they encounter this real world very early. And then there's this paradox in which we find these second years that they come to class and you start your class and they say, that's not what in real world is. And it's like, I should be saying that, not you. But they have been there. And since now we are in a huge lack of nursing and hospitals are very crowded, they are feeling that learning is not enough, that they need to be very task-oriented because the world they will be working, it's very task-oriented. So how can we challenge this situation in which the students, they are seeing in their clinical placement that they need a very work-oriented or task-oriented learning, while maybe in the university, we want them to have this value learning, competency-based learning. I don't know if I can explain. Does it make sense?
Yes,
Okay.
it does. Thank you. So the first question, can I just ask you, when they go, for the first one about the diversity, what sort of grading system do you have? So when they go to different people, is it like A, B, C, or out of 100, or pass, fail?
So while they're in the clinical placement, we have different assessments. One is the clinical one, then they have to do some tasks, and there's an assessment there, and we work with rubrics. But that's a challenge because nobody understands a rubric the same way. So we have to train a lot the nurses to understand the same way that rubrics, which is, of course, one way to understand it. So there's a lot of challenges there. But yes, normally we use these rubrics, and then there's different people that check it. And also students can self-assess themselves. And yes, so it's a great amount of different.
So the more complicated the grading system, the more unlikely it is that you're going to get any uniformity once you've got a lot of different people. So my first thing would be, if at all possible, simplify the grading system to just what is needed. You know, so if it's good enough for doctors, it's good enough for nurses. You know, do you really need to have? Do you need a rubric? Because, you know, rubrics are meant to be this thing that everyone interprets the same way, and they don't. The best way to have consistency is to have conversations, is to have a simplified grading system as much as you can. I know there'll be institutional, professional body sorts of constraints, but go as far as you can to simplify it so that it's still meaningful. But in most health situations, you really don't want to be working at a 67%. You want to be working at they're able to do it, they're not able to do it, or, not yet able to do it. Are they someone that can go and in clinical practice do this task? And then the second thing is to have conversations. And this is again about time and space. Unless the people who are all grading the same thing sit down, and I don't mean like a technical moderation meeting, I mean just sitting down with a cup of coffee and saying, what is the purpose of this assessment, this clinical assessment? What are we trying to get to here? And do we all agree on what the most essential things are, the things that, maybe, and the things that, we're really not looking at those. So that would be the answer to that in an ideal world. I should say, when you mentioned my university doesn't, it's taken 10 years for me to get them to even begin to listen to me. So it's not like they're all doing all of this and it's going swimmingly well. The second point was about the students and the pressure of going out and doing the task. And I think there's two challenges here. One is that we have to have students understand the connection between the knowledge of nursing, the things that they have to learn about how we understand the human body, how we understand how people work, how we understand different things. There's a knowledge body that they then apply. And some students on the surface can think, oh, it's coming in and learning how to give an injection. It's not, is it? There's a whole lot of knowledge behind that comes into doing that task. And I think sometimes there's a pressure, partly coming from students from a misunderstanding, of trying to separate those two. So that as if there's a world in the university and a world outside, and I suppose that's what I was trying to say, there's not. They're both the same world. They're both the real world. And what we need to do, my second point is, still on my first point, is have students understand that connection between bodies of knowledge and the drawing on them in practice. Because then that happens with the second point, that they have to understand that there is, I imagine, a correct way to give an injection. But there will never be a perfect situation, will there? There will never just be the one situation. There's the person who'll just take it, there's the little baby, there's the person who's got fear, there's all sorts of that, there's the person who's maybe not in the right... There's all sorts of conditions that are going to be different. And the student has to learn about that, and has to learn that they're going to be both engaging with knowledge and applying that knowledge in an imperfect world. And of course we need sort of the safety of perfect setups to do clinical things. But the outcome has to be that the student understands that there is that difference. And what you do when you're in that situation, because even as a trained nurse, sometimes you'll be in a situation, I've never had this before, what do I do? Well, they do two things. They draw back on the knowledge that they've engaged with, and then they draw on their experience, and they bring them together and they manage. And our students need to know that. It's not for us to prepare them for every single scenario, because we can't do that. It's for us to be able to prepare them. I'm mangling my English, which is no help, is it? But it's for us to prepare them for the uncertainty. And then just to have that, and that's again why I worry about us trying to perfect assessment, when the things there is no way that it's ever going to be perfect. There's no perfect scenario for clinical practice. And that's what a good nurse is educated for. So I suppose that's what I would put at the fore there. And it's probably what you're doing. I'm just turning it into different words. But I think it's making it clearer to the students, sometimes. Thank you for the questions.
Do we have more questions or comments? In your talk and in the answers to some of the questions, you have mentioned several times that we don't have the conditions to be able to approach assessment in the way you are proposing. There is a lack of time and spaces that are hindering us to to act this way. So can you elaborate more on these barriers, on these conditions? What would be the conditions needed to really be able to approach assessment in that dialogic way, in conversations with the students and so on?
I suppose I was sort of doing it from the other way round, to say those perfect conditions will never exist, so we have to make do. So I suppose it's looking for the conditions of making do. So the first one would be to find a place to talk to students about assessment, just to talk really openly and honestly about what it's like to sit down and mark what you do. I mean, I do this with doctoral students. And if you can imagine that context, when someone's getting near the end of their thesis, when I read the thesis, I read it in my mind as the examiner. And I'll say to the students, well, look, see there, an examiner is likely to ask such and such. So you have that conversation. And I think we can find a way to do that in first year too. We have a responsibility in an imperfect system to find some of the spaces. What if we could change things? I would change. Well, if I could change things, I would loosen up the grading systems. Now, I understand why the idea of going to complete ungrading, pass-fail might be impractical. But even for professional, and in fact, more in professional subjects, it actually does make sense. But I think we could simplify it. I think we should take away, maybe you don't, but places that still work to something like 100 point or something, 100%, we should take away all that pretense. We have to have a grading system that actually is credible, and that isn't in a lot of sorts of ways. So we should change our grading system. We should have, obviously we need quality assurance and we need oversight of things, but we should make it easier to change. And again, I don't know how British specific that is, but for us at the moment, if you found your assessment wasn't working, or maybe you go away from today and think, I've had a brilliant idea, I'm going to do this self-assessment in parts of England, you'd go back to your university and you'd have to fill in 5 forms, and then it would go to several committees, and maybe in 2 years you could do it, by which time you'd forgotten why you wanted to do it in the first place. So we need systems that are both robust but also more agile, because sometimes it's about trying things out. And I understand the lady earlier who said there's a risk there, but try and find the module. Maybe it's a third year module where you know the students from the second year. Try something out there if you can. I think the best we can do is search for spaces and time, make allies, change the discourse of assessment. This is something we can do as academics. Stop being in meetings where it all becomes incredibly instrumental. Remind people what it's really meant to be doing, and talk to our students. I know, the point of imagining is to be a bit aspirational, but as my little creatures, I hope, show, was to also show, you know what, some of those things that seem aspirational, like maybe trusting students with assessment, we've already got in the room an example of that working. So what else might we find actually is possible in an imperfect system? And higher education isn't going to get any more perfect, any less imperfect anytime soon. The pressure's on it. So it's sort of making do, but we really have to start with our own deep conviction of what matters. And remember, that's okay. That's the other thing. In a world where everyone treats you like you're meant to be cynical and worn out, and it's just the system and the systems again, you've just got to find those moments for hope. Or, move aside, let somebody else try. So I'm sorry, that's my sort of thing. When I get an academic who does this, nope, I can't, I just think, gosh, you're taking up a lovely job that somebody could come in and maybe find joy in. So, stop saying no, and try it a bit. But it is difficult. So I always try and temper this idea of being very aspirational and being very practical. And I suppose that would be my suggestion, finding that balance.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Very practical. Yeah, considering all the tensions, but it's good to be practical.
Yeah.
And then I don't know if there are more questions or comments. If not, maybe my last question would be: of course, the session was essentially about assessment and how we approach assessment, but the way in which it has been presented is, of course, very aligned, connect with how we also teach, how we also propose our students to learn, how they engage in the activities and the tasks that we are proposing them. So maybe my question is how, or what kind of teaching and learning methodologies align better with the approaches to assessment that you are suggesting?
Okay, well, the first thing is to always see teaching, learning, assessment as part of the same thing, you know. So that idea of assessment is that bit on the end. You know, we teach and we have teaching and learning and we have assessment. We have to challenge that. Assessment's got to come right in, and I don't think it's overestimating it to say that we talk about assessment at the start. And we shouldn't have assessment that checks up on learning. We have assessment that is aiding the learning and guiding it all the way through. So I think these are about challenging approaches and about open conversations with students. Students as partners, students with power. These can mean different things, but just opening up the teaching and learning to them. And I think showing students the connection between the teaching and learning and the assessment. And if you can't show that to them very early on, then I think there might be a problem. You know, so it is quite a basic idea of just seeing it about the assessment is to facilitate the learning and then be a sense of either achievement, or as an educator, then it's the opportunity, well, the student hasn't quite got it, I'm going to help them to learn more. But it has to be integrated. And that's one of the big issues we have, that lack of that sense that we're talking about something else when we're not. It's always about that. Or else there's no real purpose to doing it other than to check up on students or to give them a mark so that, you know, the right accountancy firm wants to employ them, which isn't really what we're here to do, I don't think.
Thank you very much. So we close the session now. This has been, just to recall, it has been a second session out of a series of 4 sessions within this cycle for reflection about higher education or teaching in higher education. The next session will be about education for sustainable development, and this will be announced soon by our CLIC, the Center for Learning and Knowledge. Maybe just to also summarize what has been, been engaging us today in reimagining assessment through a talk in which Jan has challenged us to question the status quo, to reflect on the real purposes of assessment and indirectly of higher education. And to dare to imagine a future where our educational practices are truly aligned with the principles of justice, equality, fairness, and so on. She has shown us that this conversation is crucial for if we are to genuinely transform the landscape of higher education. We must be willing to confront these issues with open minds and a shared determination to effect meaningful change. Thanks for allowing us to reflect about assessment and higher education from a very different perspective, to think the unthinkable. Thanks for all here for sharing insights, for engaging in challenging our preconceptions, and for collaboratively envisioning possible futures that improve the way we teach in higher education. Thanks to all.
Thank you, everyone.